Eritrea's government prides itself on its own self-reliance. It has a conscripted army, and military service is deeply entrenched in Eritrean society, especially amongst youth. Still, refugees continue to flee the country in large numbers. Now, while many in Eritrea praise their government's policies, among the diaspora, skepticism and opposition is prominent. On Monday, rogue soldiers stormed the Ministry of Information in the capital of Asmara, demanding that political leaders be released. But many are skeptical as to whether a coup could ever succeed in the country. Joining us to discuss this is Dan Cunnell, professor of journalism and African studies at Simon's College, Ambassador Herman Cohen, director of Africa programs at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, Matteo Fraschini, a freelance journalist, Robert Nolan, an editor-producer at Foreign Policy Association, and Jason Anderson, a teacher, trainer, and educational consultant who has worked in Eritrea. Ambassador, I'd love to start with you. You were the State Department mediator that arranged for Eritrea's independence during negotiations, I believe, in London in May in 1991. And as a former ambassador, these recent reports from Monday, a lot of people are questioning what actually happened. What's your understanding of the situation?
Like it was a small group of military young people who so upset with what's going on and so frustrated to decided to just take over the Ministry of Information without any real plan for a coup d'etat. Maybe they expected the whole army to join them at some point, but it looked like a very poorly planned coup. But it represents a deep dissatisfaction in society there. Every young man is conscripted.
All right. Unfortunately, I'm having trouble hearing you. I hate to interrupt you, Ambassador. I'm terribly sorry. I don't know if we have audio issues with your feed or with some of the other guests. Maybe we can try again. Could you try and continue?
I think people who are working on their computer, this comes out very loud. I don't have any problems here.
Okay, great. We can hear you now.
All right. Well, anyway, this group of young people in the army represent a deep dissatisfaction in Eritrean society. You know, young men are drafted and they don't know how long they will be in the army. It's almost indefinitely. And they're there just as cheap labor to build roads and railways and what have you. And nothing is happening in terms of economic development. It's a totalitarian state. People are put into jail for virtually no reason. And a lot of people are trying to get out. So it's a really depressing situation there.
Would you all agree? I mean, Matteo, Robert, what's your read on what's happening? For example, we have a tweet right here from Sirak Balbi. He's in, I'm not actually sure where he is, but he says, Martin Plow and Dan Connell attempting to destabilize Eritrea, fueling a virtual coup d'etat in the vain attempt to kickstart a real coup. We often hear this narrative that people within the diaspora are trying to strike up a real coup from abroad. Your read on this, Matteo?
Well, yes. I mean, everything is possible in a way, especially in Eritrea, where it's very difficult to understand what's going on. So, well, I was talking to a few contacts of mine and a few friends. Some are in Europe, some are in Africa, and they were saying that even them have doubts on what's really happening. Others were saying that actually it's better not to talk about it since, Eritrea is known for being not very good on human rights. But I think that what's very important to know is what's going on now in the area. So we have Kenya, we have Somalia, we have Ethiopia. I mean, in the last year alone, there has been a few changes. So I think that we also need to get these latest events in Eritrea into context. We have Somalia that is, slowly getting better. We have Ethiopia that doesn't have anymore his own Prime Minister, Danawi. I think things that happen in Eritrea are quite connected to the region as well.
Dan, I want to give you, I want you to get in here because people suggesting that you're trying to drum up a coup there virtually.
I think they're overblowing the impact of journalism, but I appreciate it. the reality there is complicated by the fact that the entire society is militarized, and so you have an entire generation practically in the armed forces through the national service that Ambassador Cohen mentioned. As a consequence of that and the tight lid kept on any kind of protest, the only way that anybody can act is through the military. And so I think that we've overinterpreted what happened on Monday. I don't think it was ever a coup. I think this was an example of an eruption of dissatisfaction that has been boiling below the surface. And a group decided to take it a step further and make it a public debate. I don't think they were trying to seize power. I don't think they made any demands in that direction. They wanted to get the public talking about these issues. It's my impression from contacts that I have in Eritrea that there are talks going on now, that there are more than just a handful of young people dissatisfied within the military. And I think we're going to see a lot of this spilling over into the public in the fairly near future.
Jason,
in the meantime, there is almost no public sign of this sort of thing, and it's hard to read from the outside.
Jason, we're all on the outside, of course. Would you agree with what Dan had to say, that this is a growing movement of dissatisfaction? Oh, forgive me, Jason, you're actually muted. If we can actually unmute yourself in the top right, forgive us. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was in Eritrea from 2007 to 2009, and for that period, everything I've heard sounds pretty true. I think the people who are dissatisfied tend to be obviously the more educated people, or the people who have expressed their dissatisfaction to me. I worked mainly with teachers. Teachers are people who have higher qualifications, and instead of doing military service, they actually were conscripted to work as teachers, and that was their military service. And in a similar fashion to what we heard from the ambassador, a lot of these people are left indefinitely to work as teachers as part of that military service.
So
I saw, during the time I was there, I saw a lot of dissatisfaction. I also met and knew a lot of people who weren't dissatisfied with the government, but that doesn't necessarily mean they were as well informed as they could have been about exactly what the situation was and what the government was and wasn't doing in the country. And so from that internal point of view, you know, everything so far, I would say, is very true. So
what about this notion of internal rivalries? Since you were there from 2007 to 2009, I mean, we hear within the military that that's a growing kind of, you know, phenomenon where it seems that there are almost factions. Did you pick up on any of that?
No, I didn't hear much of that at all. I was in a town called Adike, which is near the border with Ethiopia. And so I heard rumors from people I knew in the military that small troops of soldiers would sometimes defect across the border, very dangerously, across the front line into Ethiopia. That's what tended to happen when there was a small amount of dissent within the military, within a group of people, that they would actually go en masse. And strangely enough, I heard rumors that there are links across that front line between people who actually could communicate and often offer safe passage of a sort to groups of people who are wanting to move over. It definitely happened on one occasion in 2009, and I heard a rumor that it happened again in 2010. So yeah, it's difficult to analyze, because even when you're in the country, all you're hearing is rumors. And if there was such dissatisfaction, and if there were groups of people who were plotting to overthrow the government internally, I probably wouldn't have heard about them.
Robert, you know, we can't speak about Eritrea without talking about the larger, broader context of what's happening in Algeria, what's happening in Mali. How would you contextualize these reports of what's happening in Eritrea, even if they have been overblown, as Dan and others have pointed out?
Yeah, I mean, the point is that for the United States, our main objective in this part of the world, in the Horn of Africa, is stability. And over the past years, I think Matteo mentioned, you know, we've made some strong steps. So, you know, our key goals are to have a strong Ethiopia. That's our key strategic partner in the region. A quiet and stable Somalia, a stable Somalia and a quiet Eritrea. Somalia has made some great gains in the last sort of 6 months or so. They've got a government that's officially recognized now by the U.S. The African Union has been able to quell a lot of the fighting there. Ethiopia's got a new change in government where there's some potential to sort of remove some of the repression from that country. So on those two fronts, things are looking pretty good. And then all of a sudden, of course, this pops up in Eritrea. It's not really anything new. Eritrea has been destabilizing the region for a long time. There were accusations that it was funding the al-Shabaab Islamist militant group that was really destabilizing Somalia for quite a long time until the African Union troops could push them back. And this is all happening, of course, as Mali is falling apart in terms of the Islamist insurgency there that we discussed the other day,
right,
and Algeria. So, as you know, we're trying to keep a lid on this thing.
Ambassador, you know, we hear often, first of all, you know, when it comes to President Afwerki, that's his title, you know, whether he's a president or a dictator, and perhaps there's a fine line between the two, is debated. What's also debated is that recently there were reports, anecdotally friends of mine, but also within the media, suggesting that since the fall, they have been arming not ordinary people, but they have been giving weapons to people, former combatants, former people who were part of the military, because of fears of an Ethiopian invasion. Is this something that you would that you're familiar with?
Yes, I'm a bit familiar. As was mentioned earlier, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia died not too long ago, and he has been replaced by people who are trying to show how militant they are. And many of the political leaders are saying we must recapture the port of Assab, which is the port they used to use in Eritrea and the most convenient port for them. And so this has gotten tensions up between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So I think one way Isaias maintains his power is to keep up the tension with Ethiopia, to say Ethiopia is a big threat. Let's arm ourselves.
Is it a threat?
I don't think it's a threat, no. They're not going to invade Eritrea. A lot of people would like to see them do that. They're not going to do that and upset the international community. But this uses the threat, or the perceived threat, to keep the country militarized and to keep them from thinking about all their big troubles.
And in December, I should just point out that the new Ethiopian president offered to sit down with the president of Eritrea and discuss the border issues that they've been experiencing for decades. And that was true of his predecessor as well. So there's really a reluctance on the Eritrean side to sit down and engage.
All right. I do want to read a report that came in from Mai Luleta. This is 4 minutes ago in our comment section. Agreed, I think the purpose of Monday was to draw attention and hope that the mainstream media would finally pay attention to the situation in the Horn of Africa and the issues surrounding the political unrest of Eritrea. And here we are, whether we're mainstream media or not. I mean, do you think anyone else agree with this sentiment?
Yeah.
I don't think this would have happened if it wasn't for the situation in Mali at this current moment. That, you know, this has sort of turned the international community's attention to Africa. I think it's a good thing. Maybe they played it. Maybe they played it. We're trying to play that angle. But I don't think without these sort of other elements happening that we'd really be talking about this. This is a pretty fairly common occurrence.
One thing I would recommend is that the U.S. try to build up its relations with Eritrea. They really haven't been talking to each other for about 8 years now. And I think we've managed that relationship rather poorly. And I think the U.S. can contribute now to an easing of tensions between Eritrea and Ethiopia. Now that the former prime minister is no longer there, they had a personal animosity between the two heads. So I think the time might be right to reduce tensions and may even be possible to reconcile the two countries. And the U.S. can do it, I think.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. When I was in Eritrea, there was a lot of growing unrest and hostility within not just the government, but among other people towards America's attitude towards the border conflict. Of course, The Hague did in fact rule in favor of Eritrea, and Ethiopia has never respected that. And what's interesting is that Eritrean people felt very dissatisfied by that. Most Tigrinya Eritreans have close relatives across the border in Ethiopia, and they want to get back to meeting with them. They see people sometimes just a short distance away that they want to make peace with, but they can't, and they sometimes think that America has betrayed them, and America hasn't actually followed what they said they would do, because they know that America has got this unconditional support. They believe that America has this unconditional support of Ethiopia in any such events.
Well, on that point, I do want to bring up a story that I remember covering when I was at Al Jazeera, and also over the years, we see this becoming more and more common. I would love for your thoughts, Matteo, Right here, the headline kind of talking about Eritrean soccer players who have disappeared from their hotel in Uganda over the weekend have sought asylum in the East African country. These mass defections by soccer players, who I believe are some of the only ones who are able to travel to get out, once they do get out, they seem to stay there. Happens more frequently, and then it's followed up by a claim that the United Nations Human Rights Chief, Navi Pillay, is accusing the Asmara government of executions, torture, detaining thousands of political prisoners. I mean, Matteo, that's certainly happening. What's the significance of these players seeking asylum in the context of the conflict?
Well, of course, it's a very big significance, but it's not just soccer players. I mean, I'm Italian, so in Italy we have many Eritreans, being our former colony, let's say, Italian's former colony. So we keep having news about Eritreans crossing the sea and trying to get to Italy. I think that it's time for Eritreans inside Eritrea and outside Eritrea to really start talking about their country, to really start talking about what's happening. Because if Eritrea is neglected the way it is, of course, the responsibility lies first with their inhabitants. So I'm kind of disappointed actually by some of my friends that, I asked them, can you please tell me what's going on? And they prefer not to talk. So I think that this is a good time for change.
So I just want to point out, Dan, I don't know if it was you or Ambassador Cohen who mentioned that the U.S. policy in East Africa is one of stability. I believe it was you, correct, Dan? Dan, you're muted. Could you just unmute yourself? Sorry, in the top right. Thanks a lot. I know it can be startling.
Sorry.
All right, so it was you, correct?
It wasn't, but I would second the
fantastic.
The sentiment.
It was,
the thing.
Forgive me, Dan. The reason I brought this up is because we have a comment coming from Salman Sundahan saying the U.S. stance on unwavering support to Ethiopia is one of the reasons there's a strong anti-U.S. sentiment in all of East Africa, not exactly indicative of the stated U.S. policy geared towards stability. What do you make of that?
Well, I think the situation here is quite specific, as has been mentioned several times. There's a conflict going on between Ethiopia and Eritrea that hasn't been resolved for a decade. It hinges around a minor border dispute that either side could solve in a minute. And the U.S., if it stepped in and wanted goodwill there, if it stepped in and put some pressure on Ethiopia to resolve that, it would remove a barrier for Eritreans challenging their own government. And it would move the situation in a direction, I think, that would benefit everybody.
So why is that not happening then? Why the U.S. is not taking that approach?
Well, you've got both Ethiopia and Eritrea keeping the situation alive, each for their own reasons. Ethiopia wants to keep Eritrea off balance. Eritrea needs this situation in order to keep its own population quiet.
So why doesn't the U.S. step in and pressure Ethiopia?
You're going to have to ask somebody else that question. I've been asking it for a decade.
Okay, all right.
I think one of the reasons is certainly our partnership with Ethiopia when it comes to containing terrorism in the region. We do have a military base, not in Ethiopia, in Djibouti, which isn't far, but that's certainly a priority for the U.S. is containing terrorism in the region, and Ethiopia has been a committed partner to that. And it's fair to criticize that relationship on a lot of levels, especially the previous regime in Ethiopia that we partnered with, and was also very repressive.
But if that commenter was right, that the U.S. some blind support, let's say, for Ethiopia in this conflict, this tiny border dispute, if the U.S. aim was really stability, and if the U.S. could leverage Ethiopia and use its influence to change this, if the U.S. really wanted stability and there's no stability as a result of, the U.S. being seen as pro-Ethiopia, why wouldn't they try and prioritize that? Wouldn't it bring about stability, as Dan alluded to?
I mean, I think the border region has been, compared to 10, 15 years ago, has been relatively stable. So in that regard, until this recent flare-up in Eritrea and some incidents that have occurred along the way, it's been relatively stable. and certainly the U.S. has to prioritize its commitments in the region of what is important to us. Certainly, containing terrorism is more important, and it's certainly part of a wider strategy of keeping the region stable to some extent.
Yeah.
You know, if I can just add one thing here, the notion of pushing Ethiopia to accept this as a tactical move to change the situation in the region doesn't have to jeopardize the relationship. I sat down with Meles Zenawi last June and had that conversation with him. And his response to this argument that they should step back from the border conflict is that they really don't trust the Isaias regime not to use it to an advantage in a very small and continuing confrontation. And in a larger sense, Ethiopia is looking to come out of this with access to the two ports, not just Assab, but also Massawa as a part of the negotiation. Not to have them, but to have access to them. And the leverage that they have over Eritrea at this point is the border. So they're not letting go of it.
So Ambassador Cohen, then what can, and I'd love to come to you, Matteo, I saw you wanted to get in there, but Ambassador Cohen, what can the international community do in terms of trying to play, you know, we know that Afwerki is not going to be receptive necessarily. We saw the UN make certain rulings that were, you know, perhaps in the context of the conflict that were favorable to the Eritrean side of things. What can the international community do to try and usher in dialogue and solve the conflict?
Well, I think the main responsibility is with the U.S. Just during the conflict with Ethiopia, the one country that Eritrea and Isaias Afwerki trusted was the United States. And this goes back historically because of everything we did to help them get independence. And they feel that the U.S. betrayed them during the Clinton administration by favoring Ethiopia. I think we could manage that. We could get back into good relationship with them and then bring the international community to a settlement which would be a win-win, where Eritrea could stop making money through use of its port, through selling goods to Ethiopia from its light industry. And I think it's only the United States can pull that off. I met someone recently who had a conversation with an Eritrean diplomat, and he said, my job recently was to bring good relations with the U.S. back. And he says, I've totally failed. So I think the main problem is that Washington has just stopped talking to Eritrea and is considering them as a total pariah. And I think that's not the right way to go.
Matteo,
sorry, I'd just like to second that. Eritrea are very proud. Isaias Afwerki is incredibly proud. And he doesn't want to make it look like he's reaching out, but he does want that lifeline from America to continue dialogue. I've heard these ideas of internal unrest causing a coup. When you've got a country with the highest standing army per head of population, I don't think that's a possibility, because that army in itself is combined of all kinds of people, some who do and some who don't support the regime. It could be a terribly, terribly messy situation. And I think that if the diplomacy happens, Eritrea is entering a new era. The discovery of gold means a new economic era could happen for Eritrea, where they're getting foreign currency, and they may want to move forward with that. And I think they do want that lifeline to be reached out, to reach out to America.
So do you think, speaking of reaching out to America, I mean, in terms of trying to bring about or spark internal dialogue inside of Eritrea, I mean, so often when we talk about the opposition or those opposing Afwerki, it's people in the diaspora. Yeah. What do you think, Matteo, could be done to bring about more of that internal conversation? Oh, forgive me, I meant Robert. Sorry.
Okay.
Anyone, God, anybody at this point.
I would say that internally everyone is scared to say anything, basically. Anybody who does oppose the government, they don't know what's going to happen to them. And even with very, very close friends I lived and worked with, many of them would, if they wanted to, would only criticize the government behind closed doors in a very specific situation like that. I just don't think it can happen. Everyone is scared to do it.
But if I can just add, this protest on Monday was really an effort to bring that conversation out into the open. It is going on behind closed doors. It's going on within the military. And I think that what we saw was a signal of a process that we're going to see a lot more of in the coming months. I don't think it was a single incident.
Well, someone's actually echoing that sentiment. Hagar Recep saying 2 minutes ago, while I believe the event wasn't as successful or big as we all hoped, the fact that about 100 soldiers could plan something together is a great leap forward. That gives everyone hope that a little bigger operation might bring some change in the future. I actually want to give you, Ambassador, the last word, even though we were having some audio issues, because Filmin Zarai brings up an interesting angle. Eritrea has been punished by the USA for disagreeing on Somalia policy and pushing Ethiopia as a custodian of the region and invade the nation illegally. Does that ring true to you? Of course, we have audio. You're muted. I should have known better. Could you unmute yourself in the top right, Ambassador? Forgive us.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think that's not the problem. The problem is what happened during the negotiations between Eritrea and Ethiopia to end the war. And the United States was perceived by Eritrea as favoring the Ethiopian side. And this has become a very bitter issue ever since. Also, with the U.S. accusing Eritrea of supporting the Shabab, I think there was some support to the Shabab by transferring funds. But I think this ended about 2.5 years ago. So that's no longer an issue. And I think the time is right, really, for the U.S. to reach out to them and say, look, let's forget about the past and find a way to get everyone together. Now that Meles Zenawi is gone, who was Isaias's big enemy, big personal enemy, I think the time is ready to go. I would put the current Somalia issue into the game. I think it's strictly an Eritrea-Ethiopia problem that is ripe for mediation right now.
Well, we've certainly seen many defections. I appreciate your perspective, Ambassador, and your patience, all of you, with the audio issues. Thank you so much, Dan, Ambassador Cohen, Matteo, Robert, and Jason for joining us here at HuffPost Live. For, I think, the first Eritrean conversation we've had here. Hopefully, there'll be many more to come. And for those of you who want to get involved and get your voice heard, remember, you can click on the Be On Air button and record a video to send to us or to request that we book you here as a guest. So make that happen and join the conversation here at HuffPost Live.